1. So this is not an experience of mine, but rather one of my late great-grandfather's. I just remembered this after my mother brought it up. So a little backstory. He and my great-grandmother lived in a nice 2-story house in Florida. They had lived in it since their marriage and had always had the lingering thought that the house may have been haunted. Their experiences were never severe. Just little things like light footsteps in the hallways and faint voices. Well, one day their daughter, my grandmother, has to go on a trip over the weekend and leaves her 3 kids, my 2 uncles and mother, with my great-grandparents. The day they are dropped off, Saturday, nothing abnormal happens and the 5 of them all enjoy the day together. Later on in the evening, as my great-grandmother is preparing dinner, my great-grandfather is coerced into playing hide-and-seek with my mother and uncles. He is the seeker. The game is almost over within 5 minutes, as my oldest uncle and mother were not the best of hiders, or so they say. However, my uncle, who we will call C, is still missing. As my great-grandfather roamed the bottom floor of the house, he heard a floorboard squeak upstairs in the toy room. The toy room was a room that, as the name implies, kept toys for the grandchildren to play with. Well, my great-grandfather goes to the room, and the first thing he sees is the large pink chest they store some of the toys in. Something about it made him feel a person was inside. So he crept over to the chest and threw open the top, yelling, "Gotcha!" However, as he told me a few years before he passed, he was quickly silenced when he realized that while there was a boy in the chest, it was not C. The boy, as he described, had a slightly grey skin tone with an emotionless face, and wore clothing reminiscent of the 50s. This was in the late 70s. They both stared at each other for a second before my great-grandfather felt a hand touch his back. It was C. Apparently he was hiding in a hallway closet near the room. C asked him what he was doing. My great-grandfather turned back to the chest, and there was no boy inside. While this wasn't a particularly scary encounter, my great-grandfather would go on to mention the boy's eyes were somewhat unnerving. All his irises were a dark grey, almost black. This story has been told for laughs over the years over how strange it was, and is one of the many paranormal events experienced by my family. 2. So today I was sitting discussing old weird experiences with my sister, and she reminded me of a house we used to live in Michigan that bled. It was a small single-story house that sat off the gravel road in a cluster of trees. One afternoon our aunt and cousins came over, and it was so nice out that we all sat out on the picnic table and in lawn chairs to visit outside. My mother had just made a large pitcher of iced tea, so she instructed me to go in and get the pitcher from the fridge and bring it out with some plastic glasses. I ran inside and grabbed the pitcher out of the fridge and took it out, then ran back in to get the glasses. That's when I saw the drop of blood on the threshold of the kitchen door. It was a big drop, like about the size of a quarter and bright red. I thought to myself, great, I must have stepped on something and cut my foot. So I went into the bathroom and got a Kleenex and wiped the blood up off the floor, then sat down and examined my feet. Nothing. No cuts, no blood, not even a scratch. I ran out to my mom with the glasses and said, someone must have cut their foot because there was a spot of blood on the floor. My mom asked if I'd cleaned it up, and I said yes. My aunt then said for all the kids to check their feet and make sure they weren't bleeding. All of the kids did, and none were found to have any cuts. My mom then said maybe it was a drop of tea I spilt and just thought it was blood. I argued that no, I wiped it up and it was blood, and I'll even go get the Kleenex out of the trash and show you. So I go inside to get the Kleenex, and saw that there was another spot of blood on the floor in the exact spot. I ran outside and said, come look, there's another drop. My mother said, but I thought you said you cleaned it up. I said I did, but there's another drop. Someone is bleeding and just doesn't want to say that they cut themselves. So my mother told me to go clean the other drop of blood up, and bring her the paper towel so she could examine it. Then she ordered all the kids to form a line so she could personally examine everyone's feet. I went inside and grabbed a paper towel and wiped up the drop of blood, but as I was wiping it, another drop fell and landed on top of my hand. I jumped back. I looked up and saw that the blood was coming from the ceiling. I screamed and ran outside, bumping into my mother as she was running in to see what had happened. I held out my hand with the bloody paper towel and the splotch of blood on the top of my hand, and my mom grabs my hand and says, "What did you do? How did you cut your hand?" I said, "No, I didn't cut myself. The house is bleeding." My mom and my aunt too by now, plus all the other kids were staring at me, and my mother says, "Don't be stupid, houses don't bleed." I quickly pointed to the threshold where by now a small puddle of blood had appeared, maybe about a teaspoon worth, and they all looked and my mom goes, "Oh my God, who cut themselves?" I point to the ceiling, and they see the fist-sized splotch of dark brownish red that has seeped through the ceiling and is now dripping blood onto the floor. My aunt makes a sign of the cross upon herself, she was Catholic, and they do this as a means of protection, and says, "Oh my God," then ushers her kids out the door and into the car. Then she stands in the doorway of the house and tells my mother that it's demonic, and she better get us kids and get out until a priest comes and blesses the house. My mother looks at her like she's stupid and tisks her with a wave of her hand. Then my mom says, "Give me a paper towel." And she proceeds to wipe up the blood on the floor and gets a stepladder and wipes up the blood on the ceiling. We all watch to see if it bleeds again, but nothing happens right away. A few minutes later, the puddle started forming on the ceiling and then dropped a bright red drop onto the floor. My mom says that it has to be a dead squirrel that must have climbed in the attic and died. Being the smart kid and smart aleck kid that I was, I said, "But Mom, if it's dead, it wouldn't bleed fresh blood." She glares at me and gives me one of the "shut your mouth if you know what's good for you" glares and says, "Not if it just died. Go call your dad to come home and check the attic." My dad was down the street playing cards with the neighbors, so I call him and he acts frustrated, but says okay, he'll come home. A few minutes later, my dad pulls in and my mom explains what's happening. He gets a funny look on his face and tells me to get the hammer and flashlight for him, so I do. He proceeds to unnail the attic door, and I'm standing there watching him and ask why the door was nailed shut to begin with. He explains that when we first moved in, the attic door wouldn't stay closed. Then my mean mom intrudes and tells me to leave my dad alone and go sit in the living room with the rest of the kids. So, pouting, I do. Long story shorter, they get the door open and head carefully up the stairs to the attic, which is like a single large room with a small painted shut window. They just get to the top of the steps when the door slams shut on them, and my dad's flashlight dies, leaving them in the dark. My mom screams and I hear my dad yell, "Son of a bitch!" and then the hammer bang, or something. I run over and pull the door to open it, but it refuses to open, and I tell my mom it's locked. My dad kicks it open, splintering the old door in half, and they come rushing out, their faces drained of color, and my mom scared half crazy. They boarded up the entire door with heavy plywood, nailed excessively. After that, it wasn't long before we packed up and moved, and years later, I heard the rest of the story. Apparently the attic was spotless, not even dust, and then suddenly my dad's flashlight beam, aimed at about where the blood was coming from, fell on the figure of a dark hooded man kneeling on all fours. When the flashlight beam hit him, he lunged forward, growling a demonic growl. My dad yells, "Son of a bitch!" and throws the hammer at it. Then they run down the stairs as the light went out. It wasn't till years later that my mother said that in the beginning, someone had told them the house was haunted, but the rent was so cheap and down the road from our friends that they overlooked it. They also said the door to the attic wouldn't stay closed, and that if they locked it with the hook lock, they'd walk back into the kitchen and find the door wide open with a freezing cold air coming down the stairs. So they took to putting a chair up against the doorknob to brace it shut. One night after we'd all gone to bed, something knocked on the attic door and just kept pounding on it like it was an emergency. My mother took her crucifix that had been soaked in holy water and had my dad nail it to the door, and the pounding stopped. The door was the kind that has lattice rungs on it for ventilation, and my mom swore she saw a huge eye staring back at her through the slats once when she went to peek through the door. She also felt constantly like she is being watched from that door, which is why she had it nailed completely shut. But the house bleeding was the last straw, and so we moved. After we moved, my parents would drive by, and lights would be on in the attic, even though there was no electricity or wiring up there for lights. And one time, as we passed, we saw a man in black standing in the light, looking out the attic window. We stopped driving by there after that, and the house stayed vacant for years. About 5 years ago, I went back to see if, as an adult, I could pick up on anything. And it looked the same as before, but people were living in it, and they looked like they had converted the attic into a bedroom because I could see a headboard and curtains. I knocked, but no one answered. Maybe it's just as well. Has anyone else been in a house or heard of a house that bled? I'd be curious to know if it's common, or if any of you can figure out why a house would bleed. 3. I have a few, all from Ohio. First one was at my grandma's where we were ghost hunting. She has an upstairs with a bridge that goes across her living room. We were sitting in the living room asking questions when a voice yelled, and I mean yelled, my name. I slept in the car that night. The second is again at my grandma's. We were using those metal prongs used to locate water. I think they're called dowsing rods. Me and 3 friends were sitting in a circle. The rods would cross for yes and stay still for no. We would ask it personal questions and it would get the answer right. We then asked it where it would hide at. 3 times in a row it pointed to the same corner of the house. We then asked it if it would hide upstairs. Nothing. Then we asked about the main floor. Nothing. Finally we asked about the basement. And they crossed. We were a little freaked but mostly interested, so we asked to make the rods point to each other when we said their name. And I shit you not, when we would say someone's name it would stop right on them. And for those of you who are saying you probably moved the dowsing rods yourself, it's extremely hard to control them when the metal has a 90-degree bend in it, with PVC pipe on the handles, and the PVC is loose so you can't really control them. The third one is not mine but my grandma's. The night her sister died, she was asleep in the living room and woke up to see 2 white lights flying around her living room. The fourth was at my old house. Our front door would always open and close by itself. One night I had a friend over and we watched a person walk down the hallway, open the door, walk out and shut it. I asked my friend if he saw what I saw, which he did. We slept under the same blanket that night. Don't judge, I was like 12. The fifth was at Glenmont Elementary School. My aunt worked there, so we could get in with her key. I was walking in the hallway alone when I heard a little girl scream at 2 in the morning. The scream came from the second floor that was closed off by a gate. Since I was the only one who heard it, my aunt and mom thought I was lying. As we were leaving, we all heard the scream. The fifth is my grandma's, who was at the school again. She put a recorder in the room, and you hear her leaving the room. A few seconds later, you hear a little girl say, "They're gone." To this day, heard the recording about 3 years ago. I still remember what her voice sounds like, and it gives me chills and waters my eyes when I think about it. Scariest thing I've ever heard. The sixth. I was at Cry Baby Bridge, where a mother threw her child off the bridge as a sacrifice to something because she was a witch. You supposedly can hear a baby crying, hence the name. But as soon as I got out of the car, I look in the woods and see a man staring straight at us. I sat in the car with all the doors locked. The seventh one is my grandma's, who went to see the crystal skull. She said she felt like she was going to have a stroke when she was suddenly flying through space. She said she flew really close to a planet or moon. After she said she flew over the moon, she came back. A few weeks later, NASA uploaded a picture of, I believe it was Saturn's moons, and my grandma swears up and down that's what she flew over. The eighth one is I was in the woods off State Route 603 looking for ghosts for some reason. Well, we saw nothing and got in the car. The road was about 1.5 miles long. We started driving when we saw a light that looked like it was from a lantern. We were going 60 miles per hour down those roads because it freaked us out. And the whole time the light stayed right beside us. The next day we went back to where the light was, and it was swamp for about 2 miles. Hope you guys enjoyed. Anyone who ghost hunts in Ohio, let me know. Also leave any stories you guys have, I'm really interested. 4. You know how you supposedly can't make faces up in a dream? You have to have seen them before in real life. About 4 years ago, I was dealing with extremely bad sleep paralysis. I'd have recurring nightmares where I'd be lying there sleeping, and there was a man about 2 feet away from me in a chair watching me sleep. I'll never forget his face. I knew he was watching me, and I used to lie there sobbing silently in the dark because I couldn't move. Finally, I was released and would run past him to go tell my mother, where she'd walk me back into the room, and he was, of course, no longer there. I still don't know to this day whether I was dreaming or seeing an entity. Flash forward a few months. I'm on a choir trip in middle school. It's important you know I had a severely sprained ankle and was on crutches. We are in line for the Space Mountain ride, when I felt someone was watching me. I turned around and skimmed the crowd when I saw his face staring at me. He smiled. I recognized him instantly and dropped my crutches and limped away as fast as I could, crying hysterically. My friends chased me down and I couldn't even speak to tell them what I'd seen, because I was absolutely terrified. My ankle ended up being so badly sprained after this, I was in a wheelchair the rest of the trip. But I knew in that moment I had to get the fuck away from that man. I have no idea who he was or what he wanted with me. I have no idea if I saw the future in my dreams, or if he was an entity following me. I need answers. 5. So this happened when I was around 13. I told my family and friends about it at the time, and they still bring it up occasionally. But I've generally tried to forget it and still question if what I think I saw was real. Okay, so at the time, in the street I lived in, there was this abandoned police station. It had offices and a break room and even cells. And as early teenagers, my friends and I went wild and transformed the derelict into our clubhouse, moving couches and games in and drawing all over the walls. There were a lot of other children in my street, and as the police station was so close, it became the default hangout for us. If you wanted to hang out, you just walked to the station rather than to one of your friends' houses. The building was very dark and had no power, and most of its windows were smashed. It was a dump, but none of us were ever scared or paranoid there, as we were so used to it. So this incident happened, like I said, when I was around 13. One morning at around 10, I walked to the abandoned police station to see if my friends were already there. When I arrived, I called out and looked through the building, but it was empty. For a while I screwed around in one room at the back, which was our main hangout with the couches. After I'd been in the building for maybe 5 minutes, I heard some sort of creaking, shifting sound, like floorboards straining or your house creaking in the wind. It was coming from the front of the building, and I immediately assumed it was my friends arriving. I followed the noise towards some small office rooms near the main entrance. When I turned into the room, I was met with a shadow person. Textbook definition. Figure of a human, no details, blacker than black. However, unlike most shadow person encounters, it wasn't hidden in my peripheral vision. It was standing perfectly still, about 2 meters in front of me. It was very tall, and although it had no face, I felt like it was looking at me. I was so shocked that I seemed to freeze, just staring at it for what felt like minutes, but would only have been a handful of seconds. At this point my eyes were watering out of fear. I snapped out of my shocked daze, when the shadow person moved its leg and started to step towards me. With this, I instantly turned and fled, sprinting through the derelict and not looking back. Once I was outside, I looked back and saw it standing just inside the doorway in the entrance's foyer. It was still facing me like it was before. I went straight to my main friend's place and told him. Slept there the night too. Most of my friends believed me, but plenty said I was full of shit. My mother could see I was scared, but just thought I'd gotten myself paranoid. My friends and I went back to the building eventually, and we didn't find anything out of the ordinary, A few years later, it was bought and renovated into a home. To this day, I doubt what happened. Thinking logically, I tell myself I was just an overly imaginative child, but it felt so real and vivid and out of the blue. Another thing I distinctly remember was this feeling I got when I looked at it. It was a feeling of personhood. I was terrified and horrified, but it gave me this feeling that it was, or used to be, human. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 90. Well, it's going to be about 2.5 months away and we'll hit episode 100. So what would you like me to do for episode 100? I'm probably going to start gathering longer stories. I'm hoping to get stories at least 10 minutes apiece. But as I come across the super long stories, I'll be saving them special away for episode 100. But what I'd want to know is, do you want another Q&A after it? Up to you. Totally willing to do it. I generally quite enjoy doing them. And, okay, I don't know if you can hear the neighbourhood dogs going there, but it sounds like they're in favour of it. But they don't have YouTube channels, so it's up to you guys. Any other suggestions are also welcome. I'll take them on board and we'll see what we can come up with. Okay, and so with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.